Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth in the series of webinars that are highlighting NAFB research that's been conducted by Aimpoint Research. Today's presentation is being recorded for those that are not able to attend today. So again, please be sure to mute your microphone unless you're asking a question. Now, in addition to the NAFB research, we're also pleased to share with participants a portion of the Future State of Soy research that Aimpoint conducted for several states last year. I did have a sneak preview of this last summer at a meeting in Indiana. Enjoyed what I saw there, and I think you'll find some of those pieces useful. It's in the presentation this afternoon. Our host for today's call is Aimpoint's Director of Communications, Jennifer Coleman. Jennifer is responsible for the development and implementation of the communications and marketing strategy with Aimpoint. Prior to joining Aimpoint, she served as the Director of Communications with the Ohio Soybean Council and the Ohio Soybean Association, managing all communication programs, including media relations, communications research, farmer awareness campaigns, and consumer outreach. She is a graduate of Murray State University in Murray, Kentucky, received a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Organizational Communication. And Jennifer grew up, I should mention, on a small horse farm in Western Kentucky and now calls Columbus, Ohio home. So with that, I'll turn the hosting duties over to Jennifer. Welcome, Jennifer. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tom, very much. And thank you, everybody, for being here. We're going to get right into it. But first, for those of you who are not already familiar with Aimpoint Research, we are a global strategic intelligence firm that specializes in agri-food. Agriculture and food is all we do and all we think about. Our founder and several members of our team are actually former military intelligence officers who spent portions of their careers using strategic intelligence to protect national security. Other members of our team have spent their entire careers, like myself, in agriculture. Some of us even actively farm today. But no matter what our backgrounds are, everyone at Aimpoint believes that the success of the U.S. agri-food system is essential to U.S. national security. And it's that core belief that drives why we do what we do. And what is that exactly? What do we do? What is strategic intelligence? We help our clients understand what's really happening in their marketplace, what's going to happen in the future, and then what to do about it to help them be successful in that future. And those capabilities are the reasons that we work with our clients, such as NAFB, to give them some insights into many of the questions that they have about their listeners. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Tommy to talk about a little bit of background of the work that we've been doing with NAFB, as well as some of the top line results.
Thanks, Jennifer. Happy to be with you all and to present the results. And so as a partner with NAFB, we're providing strategic intelligence to you through this radio listenership research. We've conducted a quarterly market research study to understand listener habits, perspectives throughout the year. This research provides you with the context needed to cater to listeners and showcase the value of farm broadcasting to your constituents and advertisers. So in order to compare results from wave to wave, we made sure that those who answered the survey in each wave met similar criteria. And so we talked to a lot of people from different types of backgrounds. And overall, we have great distribution among a number of these demographics, such as gross farm income, age, and acres. What's been interesting to us is how many listeners raise livestock. We consistently saw over half a response raising livestock. And one thing to point out as we go through some of these slides, it's wave to wave, but there are some slides here that we moved into aggregate to kind of see how everything trended together. So throughout the year, ag radio listeners tune in through a typical work week, Monday through Friday. 3/4 of farmers are listening for at least 5 days a week. This tells us listeners are very engaged with ag radio, even more so than other platforms. We see that here, compared to other daily news sources from farm news, weather, markets, and ag information, ag farm radio is the primary source during all 4 quarters. The next 2 top sources for daily ag information are ag farm publications and ag farm TV. Also worth noting is that farmers are typically listening to not just one of those sources, but multiple. You can see how engagement varies throughout the year. Listeners utilize multiple sources for daily ag information, and most notably so during wave 2 planting season. So Which radio bands are they listening to? If radio continues to be the most prevalent sources for daily ag information. AM outperforms FM radio during each wave, and satellite radio is consistently listened to by a smaller portion of ag radio listeners. Listenership has remained high during early morning hours. The amount of listeners tuning in from 6 to 9 a.m. peaks during wave 2 and tapers off throughout the year. Listenership even increases with age in the morning. The older you are, the more likely you are to listen in the morning. The average amount of time people listen has also stayed consistent. So on average, the amount of time spent listening to ag radio on a weekday is over 1 hour. However, the amount of minutes listening does vary from person to person. And that kind of concludes what we look at in terms of the weekdays in radio listenership. But as mentioned earlier, nearly 3/4 of listeners are tuning in for at least 5 days a week. Here we see that nearly 3/5 of respondents tune in on a Saturday. Of those who do, a large portion listen before noon, and they're listening for less minutes than they do on a weekday. And on average, listeners are tuning in for about 48 minutes. Again, though, it varies from person to person. 2/3 listen for at least 30 minutes and 1/3 for at least 1 hour. And we see farmers are receiving a larger variety of types of information during wave 3. That's the third quarter during the year, which could be due to the fact that farmers are preparing for harvest. Ag markets, commodity prices, and ag weather remain a priority through each wave, though. This shows us farmers rely on farm radio as a place for a wide variety of information. And this research has showed us farm broadcasters are perceived favorably by ag radio listeners, especially when compared to national media outlets. And so we asked respondents if they feel their farm broadcaster is credible, accurate, and timely. Here we see high ratings on each mark. Whereas when we asked about this on national media outlets, listeners feel that they are not credible and not accurate. But we also want to learn about the perceptions of other sources outside of radio. And overall, over half of listeners that have ever listened, half of listeners for ag radio have ever listened to a podcast or an ag-related podcast. And in the last month of when the survey was taken for each respondent, more than 1/3 of listeners had listened to a podcast, and more than 1/4 had listened to an ag-related podcast. And finally, asked about television, ag television, and social media. So like radio, engagement varies depending on the time of year. Ag-related television viewership is highest during less active times of the growing season. So that would be wave 1 and wave 4. And same with time of day. Which we see here, ag TV viewers are most likely to tune in the early hours of the day and the evening hours. And finally, ag radio listeners are most likely to spend time on Facebook and YouTube than they are on Twitter. About half of all respondents say that they spend at least 1 minute a day on Facebook and YouTube. So overall, the value of farm radio remains high. Engagement remains strong throughout the year, and there are particular times that are especially worth taking note of. Busier times of the year, so that being planting and harvest, and early morning hours. Ag farm radio is a primary source for daily ag information, even during the slower times. And so it's seen as a place to receive a wide variety of information. So full reports from each of one of these waves of the study can be found on NAFB's website, I believe. So now I'm going to kick it over to back to Jennifer, and she's going to share some trends happening within agriculture and some of what the future might hold.
Thank you, Tommy. So in late 2020, the Ohio Soybean Council, the Indiana Soybean Alliance, the Illinois Soybean Association, the Missouri Soybean Merchandising Council, and the Iowa Soybean Association approached Aimpoint to partner on a research project to look at the future of soybeans. This was our mission, to clarify the key trends and dynamics that will impact and ultimately define the U.S. soybean industry in 2040, 20 years from now. Easy, right? Simple. Well, this is the simplest map that I could find anywhere of the global food system. How in the world can we possibly understand how all the different pieces and parts of the system connect and affect one another? On top of that, things are changing at a rapid pace. You've seen the headlines. Things are changing faster than they've ever changed before because agriculture is entering the fourth agricultural revolution, what we call the digital revolution of our industry. How can we understand how this works today, let alone what it's going to look like 20 years from now? And that's where Aimpoint's military intelligence experience comes back into play through a process that we call Fusion. Fusion is an integrated intelligence process that allows us to connect dots, see things from different points of view, and be able to take a view of the future and predict what the future trends will look like. Now, for this project specifically with the soybean checkoff states, we went through 2 phases of intelligence collection and 2 phases of analysis before we even approached the Fusion process. In addition to open source data collection, we also conducted 23 in-depth interviews from experts on the soybean industry and its markets across the value chain, and applied our own thought leadership platforms, Farmer of the Future, Next Gen Consumer, and our work with the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives on the resiliency of the agri-food value chain. Now, I'll be honest with you, the very first briefing that we gave to the 5 states on all of the intelligence that we collected and the analysis that our analysts did was resulted in an intelligence briefing that was 3.5 hours long. That's how much work and data went into this project. I'm definitely not going to sit here and talk to you guys for 3.5 hours, so don't panic. I'm just going to give you a brief highlight, but know that if you have any questions about the trends that we're seeing, we're happy to talk with you after the webinar about some of those things. I also want to ask, we have permission from the 5 states to talk about this project with you guys, but would prefer if you keep the information confidential and not pass on to other groups without permission. But if you would like to know more information, I'm happy to talk with you after the webinar. So let's get into it. Let's see what some of the trends that we're seeing and where we see the future going. First, going to start close to home with farm financials, retail, and farmers of the future. So as we know, as we exit the pandemic here, hopefully, we're seeing prices recover. We're seeing commodity prices definitely come up and coming up for soybeans in a very, very big way. However, and we're also seeing exports also going up, record soybean exports, especially for the 2021 marketing year, something that we've not seen before, driven a lot by China, but other markets as well. But keep in mind that real estate debt in the farm sector continues to climb at record highs. Farm sector liquidity is actually forecasted to decline. In 2020, nearly 39% of net farm income in that year is attributable to government payments. E-commerce is being increasingly adopted among ag retailers and non-traditional players in the space. This is something that's coming on strong, and we do feel that it is going to transform how farmers are purchasing inputs on their farms. Data-driven agriculture is going to reshape the agricultural economy and agri-food value supply chains. This is something that big players, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, are definitely coming into the space. And right now we have the data is being collected in agriculture, but nobody has actually connected the data and put it together. But for sure, many big players are working to do that. And one way or another, they're going to figure it out. And when they are able to connect all of these dots and connect the data, it's going to transform the value chain and how we look at things like transparency and traceability as well. You all know the consolidation is continuing in ag retail. This is something that's been happening for a long time, and it's only accelerating. And that's also going to change the way that the ag value chain looks. Another topic that's really important when we talk about the soybean industry and agriculture in general really is sustainability and electrification of vehicles. Now, we know that climate change is dominating federal policy. It's dominating global policy in many places. And agriculture is recognized to be an immediate carbon solution in many places. But this is a scary question for a lot of us, but something that we have to consider. Will the risks of climate change become integrated into our financial risk assessment systems? And the answer is probably. The percentage of central banks that are looking at ESG and sustainability as links in many of the loans and financial risk assessments are increasing. In fact, in just one example, an article last year, sustainability-linked loans have proved of a very particular interest to a lot of investors. In fact, in 2018, this particular financial sector was a $50 billion industry, and that has grown only since 2018 to $330 billion of new issuance. What about consumers? What are consumers looking for when they think about sustainability? They're looking for chemical-free. This is a trend that we have tracked for many years in our own consumer research, and that is something that the consumers consistently say that they want. They want less preservatives, fewer chemicals in their food. However, that tends to be for them, whether it be organic or other types of labels on their food in the grocery store. And food companies are investing in this because that's what their consumers want. Food companies exist to give consumers what they're asking for, and they're making a lot of commitments, not just in sustainability and environmental sustainability, but they're making commitments in chemical-free and reducing chemicals in their supply chains as well. So this is also a growing trend that we have to watch. It's not just here in the US. We're beginning to see implications across the globe. The most recent example being Mexico in 2021, banning the import of glyphosate. So this is a trend not just here in the US, but globally, and we believe that this trend is going to continue. Farmers are going to still have pests and disease that they have to contend with. So if they were to have 20 years from now fewer chemicals in their toolbox, what are they going to have to combat some of these challenges they have on farm? And that's why we believe that genetics, biologicals, and AI are going to advance quickly and become a major input for farmers, much more than they are now. And our analysts don't just look at consumer trends, we also follow the money. And if you see where a lot of investment is going in from some of these big companies, you can see that they are investing heavily in specifically biologicals. Biologicals, we do believe you have to watch very closely, especially in soybeans and corn. It's going to make a really big impact in how farmers are managing pests and disease and weeds on their farms in the future. Now, we can't talk about sustainability without talking about electrification, EVs. What is going on with EVs? We see the headlines. Is it really going to be as big of a deal as we see? Well, taking a look at some of the trends in the analysis, what we see is major vehicle manufacturers are making very significant EV commitments. And they're not just making the commitments, they're also building facilities to build these things. In my hometown of Kentucky, for example, they're going to be building a battery plant. Ford will be building a battery plant to support the EV demand that they see coming. We also see major companies beginning to exit the ethanol business. Now, what are the implications of this if they shift? How quickly is this going to happen? There are a lot of companies out there trying to predict how quickly it's going to come on. But in general, if what we're seeing is that most are predicting that 25 to 30% of new car sales by 2030 will be EVs, and 45 to 50% of new cars will be EVs by 2035. We also see these particular years popping up in policy. California has announced it will prohibit the sale of new gas-powered vehicles by 2035. And globally, Canada, as just one example, has announced in 2021 that it will also ban the sale of new fuel-burning cars and light-duty trucks starting in 2035. So those years, the policy is beginning to line up and the trends are coming together on that timeline. Now, when we talk about electrification and ethanol, it's a different story for renewable diesel. Those are two different types of fuels. So when we're talking about soybeans and the future of soybeans as a fuel, we've in the past always talked about biodiesel, but now we're talking about renewable diesel, which is different. We're also talking about sustainable aviation fuel. One of the trends that we're tracking is this really interesting partnership between companies like Marathon and ADM. Bunge and Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips are beginning to partner with grain facilities to build new grain facilities to crush soybeans to get the oil because they see such demand rising for renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. There's a lot of projections out there, and those projections are high regarding the renewable diesel production capacity. You can see here, even by 2024, proposed or announced capacity that is expected for renewable diesel. So again, when we talk about the move to electrification and carbon interest when it comes to our vehicles, it's a different story for ethanol than it is for biodiesel, and that's going to have huge implications on soybeans, and we're already seeing it. In fact, something that at one point, many of us may have thought we would never see. And that is the value of soybean oil is actually approaching 50% of the value of the crush. Now, for a soybean, only at most 20% of the bean is the oil. So 20% of the soybean is approaching to be 50% of the crush value. And that's being driven by the demand for renewable diesel and the projections for the demand for the sustainable aviation fuel. Very, very interesting trends for those of us that have been in the soybean industry as long as we have. Another really interesting trend that must be followed is food is medicine, and my favorite topic, battle for the protein plate. Now, we have heard for many years that global protein demand is growing, and that's a great thing, especially for soybeans, especially for our livestock farmers. And we only see that trend continuing to grow for many reasons. But at the same time, we have consumers are beginning to really desire healthier food choices. They're seeing health in a different way than they have in past generations. And we can tell you that based on all of our consumer trends that we've been tracking recently, COVID actually did nothing but accelerate this trend. And that's something that we have to focus on when it comes to the future of food, and especially in the soybean industry and protein. Now, the concept of food as medicine, what is that? Food as medicine is the idea that people are really beginning to tune into the concept that what I eat is important for my health, not today, but also in the long term. The government is also picking up on this, and we see trends where they're beginning to implement food as medicine plans and policies where they see this as a way, changing the way that people eat and moving them to healthier eating patterns will help them save on healthcare costs. And so we have a variety of trends kind of converging toward this food as medicine concept. And we believe that this is going to be a big driver in a number of ways. This is a picture that I took of a local restaurant here in Columbus, Ohio. I won't tell you what restaurant it is. I went out to get lunch and I took a picture. And if you notice, this is not just something in concept, it's really happening. You can see here on the label as I was going down the line, I could choose different ingredients. And if I'm looking to add antioxidants or vitamin D or maybe some vitamin K to my diet for health reasons, I can choose different ingredients to put into my lunch bowl in order to get some of those vitamins. So, it's not something just in concept. We're beginning to see this trend really kind of evolve and consumers see it on a day-to-day basis. Now, great news for soybeans. Protein is considered a high quality calorie. However, all of these trends, wanting more protein in our diet, but also wanting healthier, is also driving demand for plant-based alternatives. Now, I know all of us in ag get, hair goes up on the back of our neck a little bit when we talk about plant-based alternatives. I get it. But bear with me, stick with me for a little bit longer because I really want to dig in on this trend and talk about it a little bit more. Plant-based meats is a rapidly growing market, and it has the potential to achieve double-digit market share. We've already seen this happen in the plant-based milk industry as well. Now, in the soybean industry, for many years, we've thought, well, if soybeans aren't going to feed the animals as feed, but they're going into human food for some of these plant-based alternatives, is that good for soybeans? Is that bad for soybeans? Is it a one-to-one? So our analysts did the math to kind of see how this might play out. And what they found was that a bushel of soybeans can produce enough soy protein concentrate for 3.5 quarter-pound beef burgers or 350 Impossible burgers. Definitely not one-to-one. Now, it's also true that, beef cows and dairy cattle don't really eat a lot of soybeans, but what about chicken? A bushel of soybeans can produce enough soy protein concentrate for 383 servings of chicken nuggets or 698 servings of chicken nuggets. If we were to look at one scenario, let's say that alternative proteins were to displace 20%, only 20% of beef, pork, and chicken in the US market alone, it would mean a loss of 209.7 million bushels of soybean demand and 811 million bushels of corn feed demand lost. Not as a significant hit to soybeans as corn, but also keep in mind, remember the trend that we talked about with ethanol and renewable diesel as well. So there's definitely a trend toward soy becoming a much bigger and more important crop than it has ever been in the US. Now, we also, you can see it in the media that veganism and vegetarianism among US consumers especially is not really growing. I mean, it's kind of a flat trend. And that's really not what we're talking about though. What we're talking about is something called flexitarian. So a flexitarian is a person who doesn't necessarily identify as a flexitarian, but it's a person who incorporates both meat and plant-based alternatives into their diet. This is something that we see growing in the consumer research that we do on a monthly basis. Now, this isn't a crazy idea. We already rotate the proteins that we eat, right? We don't eat beef every day or chicken every single day. We rotate. And in the future, what you might see is that a family might have pork chops on Monday, impossible tacos on Tuesday, chicken and tofu on Wednesday, but they're still going to want their beef pot roast on Saturday night. And oh, by the way, don't forget to pick up milk at the store, both dairy and almond, because everybody in the family is going to want something just a little bit different. Now, you may think that, we're saying two different things, right? Globally, protein demand is really growing, but we're also talking about these alternatives. And what does that really look like in the future? If you imagine global protein demand as a plate, right? That plate is getting bigger. And the natural assumption is that all of these traditional proteins that we're used to are going to have to grow in order to fill the demand, fill this plate. But we have alternatives that are entering the market, and they're going to take up a piece of this plate. That's a certainty. The question is it going to be a little piece of the plate, or is it going to be a big piece of the plate? And oh, by the way, this is not just a plate for people. It's a plate for pets, and it's a plate for livestock. What will be the world's largest insect protein facility that's being developed to create insect protein for animal feed demand is being built right in the heart of corn and soybean country in Decatur in central Illinois. So what is this plate going to look like in 2040? We don't know. We don't know what this plate's going to look like, but we do know that this particular area is not something to be dismissed, and it's something that is ripe for disruption and something that as an industry, we must keep an eye on so that we can set ourselves up for success no matter where the consumer trends go. Now, that was just a snapshot of many of the trends that we tracked for this project and continue to track on an ongoing basis. But if we take all of those into account, what does it really look like? What does it really mean? What does the future look like? And I'm going to walk you through what we see 2040 beginning to look like. First, global demand. Global demand for protein will remain strong, driven primarily by China. Glyphosate, though, we believe will be banned by this point in many countries around the world. In the financial services sector, sustainability practices will be a measure of risk for access to capital. Carbon potential, soil quality, and water resources will be accounted for when determining things like land values. Midwest soybean farmers are likely to have better risk management profiles due to their soil quality and the availability of water. Ag inputs. This will be characterized by a reduction in chemical inputs. And by this point in the future, we do believe that biologicals will be the lead ag input. Chemicals will still be available, but they won't be the number one input on the farm in that way. For distribution and ag retail, some farmers by this point will be purchasing direct from what we call the Amazons of ag. The geographical boundaries that farmers have had in the past when it comes to choosing inputs to purchase for their farms will be eliminated. And many will be using integrated ag inputs and algorithm management recommendations to make these choices. The distribution and retail system by this point will have consolidated down from a 3-step system to a 2-step system. When we look at farms, we will see fewer and larger farmers contributing to checkoff membership organizations, and a greater number of acres will be dedicated to specialty or premium soybeans. Carbon neutrality by this point will be a requirement to even compete in the marketplace. Processors will be increasingly paying soybean farmers to store and deliver differentiated products, and traceability will have been implemented across the soybean supply chain at scale. And we also believe by this point there will be 2 C's in the ABCDs as China has transformed the global grain trade through its major food company called COFCO. Food and retail, you'll see vertical farms co-located with grocery facilities. Imagine walking into Costco and putting your products in your basket and then walking out back to the greenhouse and picking fresh strawberries off the vine. continued vertical integration in this space will be occurring. Consumer demand is going to be driven by customized food solution and personalized nutrition, and maybe even in some cases, preferential ratings in an algorithm. Consumers are going to expect and, not or. They want healthy and they want environmentally friendly, and food companies will find a way to give it to them. By this point, alternative proteins will be priced competitive with meat and regularly consumed. So when it comes to the future of soybeans, there are three primary things that we have advised the soybean industry to really focus on, and that is that protein plate, the mix of protein, and the fact that that is really an area that we can't take an eye off of, even though protein demand is growing. You know, soybeans are at the top of the mountain in a lot of ways for both feed, fuel, and fiber, but that means that a lot of competition is going to be gunning for that spot and coming at them and trying to capture some market share. And then these connected ecosystems, people will figure out a way to connect the data, and you're going to look at more of a shorter, more consolidated value chain. And then the consumer influence of food, so goes the consumer influence, so that moves the rest of the value chain and what farmers are doing. As consumers move faster, farmers and the rest of the agri-food value chain will have to move quicker and be more nimble in order to meet many of those demands. That was a really fast overview of the future state of soy. It's been a really, really fun project for me personally to work on as somebody who's been in the soybean industry pretty much my entire career. But with that, Tom, if we have time, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Some great insight, I think, there, folks, as to what the future of the soy business looks like in the next less than 20 years. And we appreciate Aimpoint being able to share that information with us, as well as the summary of our 2021 NAFB research. I'd open it up to any questions that any of our participants here might have. Any questions for anyone? All you have to do is either unmute your mic or hit press the space bar, hold on to the space bar to speak. All right, hearing none. Again, Jennifer, Tommy, we appreciate the time. The NAFB research slides are available on the NAFB website. You do have to log into the website. They're listed under the More menu under Research. We'll also, as I mentioned, are recording this webinar today, and we'll have that available on the NAFB YouTube site for folks to be able to watch there if they'd like to recap any of this information. Thank you so much for your attendance, and we'll look forward to catching up with several of you soon at Commodity Classic, as well as at other events down the road. Have a great afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.